the sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. I was talking with my daughter Lena 2 nights ago about her postgraduate plans. She is due to finish college mid-year in this December, having taken a semester off before she transferred to Bard. And she doesn't particularly want to leave right away, in part because it will be December, but mainly because she really loves the Hudson Valley. And she's become really close to the owners of the Tivoli General Store where she works. And they live on a farm which stocks the store with meats and eggs and cheeses and fresh produce, and I highly recommend visiting the store if you haven't been there before. They also have a great collection of craft beers. And she said, "Mom, I can always build a tiny house and live on the farm next to the goat pen." Now, if I were talking to my parents in 1982 about this, they would have looked at me like I had 8 heads. What the heck is a tiny house? They would wonder. And actually, my dad would probably walked out the door in smoldering silence, wondering why in heaven's name he ever paid 4 years of tuition bills. But I, on the other hand, thought, wow, this sounds like a really reasonable plan. It's sustainable, it's an economical way to get your feet on the ground, and it's kind of hip and trendy. And after all, she's a Bard student. But the tiny house, you know what I'm talking about. The tiny house movement is sweeping the nation. People are abandoning traditional homes, the kind of housing that I grew up in with multiple bedrooms and a few bathrooms and a yard, and they're moving to tiny houses, which can be as small as 400 square feet. And they're portable. So if you want to live in California, well, you can. And then if you decide you want to live in Tivoli, New York, you can just hitch up your house and drive east. If you've ever looked at a tiny house, it's actually really interesting to see how innovative the designs are in maximizing this small amount of space. There are beds that fold up into the walls, and you can put bookshelves in the stairs, and if you have a TV, you can sink it down into the floor and put your dining table on top of it so that you can eat dinner. So less is more is really the design feature, and it's making designers a whole lot of money these days. But today's reading from John's Gospel portrays something that is quite the opposite of a tiny house. The version, the New Revised Standard Version that we read says, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places." And what's clearer, I think, is the Common English Bible, which says, "My Father's house has room to spare." There's nothing tiny about God's house. There is room for everyone. Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to prepare a place for them, and this work was done the very next day after he said these words. He prepared a place for them and for you and for me through his self-offering on the cross. And this opened the door, as it were, to God's big house. And now everyone is invited to go in. As I mentioned, one of the selling points of a tiny house is that it is portable, so you can take your house anywhere you want to live. All you need is a clear spot, and you can plant yourself there. If anyone were to ask the way to your tiny house, it could very well depend on where you happen to be in any given season. But Jesus describes God's big house as only having one address. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." There's only one way to get there, and it is Jesus. Doesn't this seem a little bit limiting, though? Didn't Jesus say that there were many dwelling places? And now he's saying that he is the only way to the Father. With billions of people in the world, and only a part of them, maybe 30%, are Christian, it would be tempting to think that the Father's house, though not tiny, might be smaller than we previously thought. But if that's where we are, perhaps our understanding of God's house needs to flip. House flipping shows, I don't know if you've seen any of them. I sort of like to watch them from time to time. But they are often melded with home improvement shows. And I imagine Doug and Jimmy Crisp are cringing at the mention of these. But house flipping shows show people buying a house as cheaply as possible, fixing it up, and then selling it for as much as possible. One of these shows, called First Time Flip, features amateurs in real estate and contracting attempting to pull off one of these projects. And sometimes things go so badly that they have to try to sell the house as is. In other words, no matter how badly they botch the job, they try to get whatever they can for it and then get out as quickly as possible. When it comes to understanding the concept of God's house with many dwelling places, we might feel like those first-time flippers. It's easy to feel like an amateur when thinking about the things of God, especially when we realize that thanks to the Great Commission by Jesus, who gave it to us to make disciples of all the nations, it is our job to issue the invitations to the big house. We might feel a little unqualified for this. The disciples certainly did. In that upper room with Jesus, having spent 3 years following him, were still confused and a little stupid in this regard. And Philip shows this. He says, "Lord, show us the Father, and then we'll be satisfied." And this earns a question from Jesus. Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still don't know me? And he continues kindly that if Philip does not know Jesus, he can at least believe the works that Jesus has done. And that can make sense, because Jesus has done amazing things. He's changed water into wine. He's healed thousands of people. He's fed thousands of people with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. He's walked on water. He's given blind men sight. And he's raised Lazarus from the dead. So Jesus' instructions to believe these signs as proof that he is in the Father and the Father is in him make sense. What may not make sense to us, however, is what Jesus says in the very next statement. The one who believes in me, will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these, because I'm going to the Father. I don't know about you, but this makes me feel like this is Bob Vila or any of those TV rock star contractors telling me who owns a hammer and a screwdriver, that I'm going to build an even greater house than what he builds. It totally defies our common sense. And it would be nonsensical but for the fact that none of what Jesus is describing relies on our own abilities or power. Jesus says, "I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it." So when Jesus says that we will do greater works than the ones he did, he didn't mean that we are doing them on our own. His position at the right hand of God is a power position, the power tool to our manual tools. And when we ask for anything in his name, then absolutely anything is possible. So there's a great deal of encouragement and not confusion in these passages. We know that we have a place in God's big house. The trend these days is to build tiny houses, but God's house has room to spare. And though we know that it is not up to us to decide who enters the house, we can play a role in issuing invitations. Even if we feel completely unqualified for the task, we do know that the master builder is behind us, and the gifts and the abilities we have to do the job are actually from God. And so we should hear Jesus' words with humility. We can be grateful that we know him and that our place in the Father's house has been prepared. And we can be energized for action so that others can take their place as well. God, in God's infinitely mysterious way, will bring all to the doorstep. We just need to make sure that we're looking out for any opportunity to invite people there. And most energizing to me, God's big house is meant to be explored. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, talked about the spiritual journey as a house. We enter the door the moment we accept God's love and God's salvation. Then we have the rest of our lives to explore the house as we grow closer to God, going from room to room through threshold to threshold of sanctifying grace. In God's house, there are many dwelling places. There is room to spare. We are invited to expand our own spiritual house and to expand our concept of who can enter. In this case, less is not more, and bigger really is better. Unlike many DIY home improvement shows, however, we do not need to do the work ourselves. It's not first-time flip. It's more like a bunch of people showing up and starting to make those home improvements, except it's God who shows up. All we have to do is open the door and let the work begin. It takes humility to invite the work to begin, to open that door and step aside. But it also inspires gratitude. This humility and this gratitude do not lead us to be judgmental with others, but to be enthusiastic in spreading the good news. If a bunch of people came and repaired your house or helped you to build a tiny house, you wouldn't then look down on someone else with a not-so-nice house or without any house at all, as if you had fixed up or built your own home. No, what you do is you would tell the story about how your place was a mess or was non-existent and someone showed up and helped you. That's what the invitation to discipleship sounds like. It's stepping aside and holding the door open, trusting that just as there was room for you, there is room for everyone. Indeed, there is room to spare in God's house. Amen.